or that they are inherently suffering because they're bad. He says that feeling, these feelings, sorry, I have to start over again. People who do not have happy feelings suffer. They think that they are the owners of their feelings and that the feelings belong to the self. In other words, we identify with our feelings. When we feel bad, we think we are bad, or we think that there's something wrong with us. The perception is that we're bad, we're wrong, we're suffering, it's self, it's never going to change, I'm depressed. And it's reconfirmed by someone who says, oh, you're suffering depression. Instead, it's just a feeling that comes and goes. If we attach to these feelings, we might attach to the idea that we're being punished, or that we are evil, or that there's something inherently wrong with the self. This wrong understanding of self can lead to much guilt, confusion, and suffering, and depression, amongst other things. The idea that the mind is originally, or that the self or the soul or some part of the mind is originally guilty, and it's always going to be suffering, can create quite a bit of suffering. Whereas from the Buddhist perspective, the mind is originally pure. And if you read works by the Dalai Lama, he speaks about that regularly, that the mind is originally pure. One Western monk who studied at Wat Bananachat in the eastern part of Thailand gave discourses about realizing that if the mind is originally pure, it's much easier to clean it up again than if it's originally dirty, which we won't ever be able to clean it up. And so for him, coming from a Christian family background where the original sin concept was quite strong, he was very inspired to think that, well, at least I can clean it up. I've made it dirty, so I can clean it up. So this is another way to look at things. The idea of self in Buddhism is like identification with the thought process, identification with the feeling process, identification with our habits and our memory and perceptions and all of these things. Whereas if we understand non-self, it's like the flux and accepting the flux and flow that happens, or even change in our perceptions. That what we might think is one thing might be a different thing to somebody else. And so if once we're really attached or holding on to the perception of the self, that also is a fever, it's suffering. It's like it creates a certain inner heat. And so here Ajahn Tong asks, what are the 4 medicines to cure these 4 fevers or states of perversion? He says the 4 foundations of mindfulness, or satipatthana, they are the cure to these 4 causes of suffering. We have first the mindfulness of body, kayanupassana, which cures the fever of sensual desires, or kamaraga. In Thai they say kamarak. When we practice mindfulness of the body, we will not fall prey to the sensual desires. We will not be able to perform unwholesome deeds. In other words, you're aware of your body, and so when you start to do things like killing or stealing or other very negative activities with the body, your mindfulness just stops you. You can't do that. There's an automatic braking system. We might even realize the repulsive nature of the body, and so we're not attaching to it or identifying with it in the same way. We will not become deluded or attached to the perception of beauty in an unwholesome way. He says mindfulness of the body reduces and eliminates sensual desire and purifies the physical and verbal behavior. So it's difficult to say words that are harmful or do deeds that are harmful. So the physical basis becomes purified. Mindfulness of feelings, vaitananupassana satipatthana, cures the fever of the sensual pleasure or attachment to only wanting happy feelings. We begin to see that feelings come and go. Many unpleasant feelings arise and cease. Suffering feelings arise and cease. Pleasant feelings arise and cease. Happy feelings arise and cease. Neutral feelings arise and cease. It's changing all the time. And in a way that even the pleasant feelings coming and going is kind of dissatisfactory, so we're not attaching as much as we did. If we try to identify only with the happy moment and push away the unhappy moment, we're living in a constant stress. And so perceiving that the feelings don't last, when you're mindful of the feeling, you'll see that even your painful feelings begin to change. Of course, at times when we're sitting in the same position, we might need to slowly move and adjust the position instead of resisting. One Dharma teacher commented that suffering equals pain times resistance. another one of the equations. He says S equals P times R. Suffering equals pain times resistance. So how much do we resist pain? Of course, we may experience pain. It is the human condition, or any sentient condition, to have some degrees of pain. The question is, what do we do with it? How do we identify with it? One example that I see often in Thailand is the toddler example. And here the toddler example is the young mother and father walking down the street with the toddler who falls on his face, which happens, and the parents go, "Oh, you fell," and start laughing, and the baby looks up and says, "Yes, I fell," and they pull him back up and he doesn't cry. But if you see that example in America, quite often it's the opposite effect. It's like, "Oh my God, you fell, you're dying, let's call 911. And the baby looks up and says, "Oh my God, my parents are angry," or they're shocked or whatever, and he starts crying. And so it's something about perception and conditioning. Perhaps there's pain. Later the Thai baby goes, "Oh, it hurts," you know, and the parents will blow on it. And he might fuss a little bit, but then they forget about it very quickly. So how much of this experience belongs to the self? I think that's also conditioned. It was gone in a moment, and they continued walking. And you'll see that quite a bit if you go to Thailand. They still do have the ability to practice this method of shifting the awareness from the painful to the other condition, so that we don't hold on to the pain. We can see it and experience it and understand it, and if it's necessary to move and adjust, we can do that. And which I'll talk about in the meditation. At other times when we're meditating, we might want to persevere with it and look at it to see what it really is. Painful feeling, which we can discuss also some more, is actually considered one of the better meditation objects, because the mind which is contemplating painful feeling is quite pure. It's not filled with desire or lust, for example. It's like, oh, there's a pain. There is some resistance, but if we can overcome resistance, then we're also overcoming fear and anger. Okay, if you can learn to be equanimous and even in a way compassionate and open-minded around the pain, then you'll see that it begins to release. If you're contemplating painful feeling, you also begin to understand the characteristic of suffering, of the three characteristics of the impermanent, suffering, and non-self. And if you contemplate the painful feeling, you might also be able to enter and realize what is called the noble truth of suffering. And so the masters always encourage the student to persevere with painful feeling and not try to avoid it. At the same time, we're not going into an extreme situation where we're forcing ourselves, but we're not running away from it. And so that's regarding the mindfulness of feeling. So what he means here is that when we contemplate feeling, we begin to see that attachment to feelings, more than the feelings themselves, gives us the suffering or causes the fever of the sensual pleasure attachment. And so if once we're mindful of feeling, we'll see that feelings come and go, and we may still experience happy feelings and pleasant feelings. But if once we let go of the attachment to it, it's not like we're addicted to the happy feeling. We're not suffering from the addiction to it. So there's a clearer mind basis which experiences that. Mindfulness of the mind cures the fever of the permanence or perception of permanence, which is like seeking for a continuity in that, for example, the happy feeling. The person who practices mindfulness of mind will realize that the mind and all states of consciousness are in a constant state of flux. And so if you're sitting in meditation, you'll see that your mind really moves around. It's anicca, it's impermanent. The mind is constantly moving, changing, jumping from object to object, just like a monkey jumping from a tree to another tree. The untrained mind cannot stay still even for a moment. It's always moving, and we see that with children most often, but even in the adult person, we see that the mind is always moving. A meditator will begin to realize that, and in the beginning of their meditation might become quite frustrated by it. Seems like the mind is moving all over the place. But if you're being trained how to contemplate it mindfully, you'll realize, well, that's the nature of the mind. There will be an object. And so the stress of I don't want to think, or I'm not supposed to think, or I'm just supposed to sit here and not think, and that's a kind of stress right there, that will cease. We learn to identify thoughts coming and going and let them go. And at some point, we find peace with that. In the process, the meditator will realize that everything is impermanent, especially the mind, and especially physical phenomena and feelings as well. Mindfulness of the mind cures the identification and attachment to the illusion of the perception of permanence, which I think paints a lot of the suffering in our world. It's like it's always going to be that way, it's never going to change. There's something wrong with me, I'm imperfect or something. Mindfulness of the mind objects, or Dhammanupassana, cures the fever of self, or atta. By self they mean identification with those aggregates of the body and the feelings and the memory and perception and the mental formations or habits or attitudes or volition, and with the consciousness process, which is the seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling, thinking, through which we receive all this information, and then identify with I'm seeing, I'm hearing, I'm smelling, I'm tasting, I'm feeling, I'm thinking, and I'm knowing, and I'm here, and I'm a self for a moment anyway, and then it passes. But mindfulness of the mind objects will show you that actually there's a lot going on that doesn't really belong to you. Maybe even some old habits that you inherited from your parents or other people close to you. That's not written here. But the person who practices mindfulness of the mind objects will be able to destroy the attachment to the self or ego. Attachment, meaning the identification. Mindfulness of the 5 hindrances, 5 aggregates, 5 sense spheres, and 7 factors of enlightenment, 4 noble truths, and noble eightfold path. These are all what are called mind objects, will lead to the deep and profound understanding that there is no abiding self-principle, no permanent ego. The person who practices mindfulness of the mind objects will realize that everything in this world is impermanent, suffering, and non-self. In fact, the person who practices all of these mindfulness objects will eventually destroy what is called wrong view about self, or sakkaya ditthi, which is one of the fetters that binds humans and other beings into the cycle of samsara. And so if you really practiced it, you would enter a state of transformation of the mind. And so the 4 foundations of mindfulness, which I kind of gave the overview as the cure of these 4 fevers, or inner and outer conflicts which are caused by our attachments, were actually a teaching given by the Buddha, one of his principal teachings, which we find as a thread running through most of the Buddha suttas. You hear the word or see the word sati, or mindfulness, running through his teachings. And now in the West, we find that mindfulness practice is very popular, and in America especially. I think Europe it's coming up, and it looks like per capita in Israel we're doing quite well considering that it's a small country with a very interested population, at least the people that I've met so far. And so we're not far behind. Thailand has had a resurgence in this kind of meditation since the mid-80s. When I arrived in Chiang Mai, there were very few of the meditation schools, and now they're cropping up all over Thailand. And in fact, next to going to the beach and having a good time, spa resorts and meditation centers are quite a big, not industry, that's not quite the right word, but something like that. Not business either. They're popping up anyway. Along with, yoga centers are trailing behind, but yoga's not really a Thai kind of a thing. They're more interested in the Buddhist aspect. But the Western people who come in really enjoy very much. Mindfulness as a teaching can be found in several of the suttas of the Digha Nikaya, or the long discourses of the Buddha, in particular the Great Discourse on the Four Foundations of Mindfulness, and the Discourse on the Four Foundations of Mindfulness as found in the middle-length suttas of the Buddha. And here the Buddha pointed out to the monks that there's this one-way path to the purification of beings, to overcome sorrow and sadness, to be free from pain and suffering, to see the truth of life, and to realize nirvana, or in the Buddha's words, nibbana, Nipan in Thai. And that is to say the four foundations of mindfulness. And here the four foundations are contemplation of the body as body, contemplation of feelings as feelings, contemplation of the mind as mind, contemplation of the mind objects as mind objects. Contemplation of the body, it means bringing a mindful, attentive awareness around the movements and positions of the body. Whether standing, walking, sitting, lying down, bending, stretching, raising, lowering, or moving the body in any particular manner, that is one of the meditation objects. Another one outlined in the sutta is contemplation of the physical properties or elements of the body. The stiffness or softness, the heat or the motion, solidity or density, or other aspect of the four great elements which might manifest in the body. The four great elements being earth, water, air, fire. Contemplation of the body also included some of the more esoteric practices like the charnel ground meditations, or observing corpses in various stages of decomposition, or what is another one? The loathsomeness of food. That wasn't in the contemplation of body, but the contemplation of death, I believe, was another aspect that they were looking at. In the meditation center, we have little exercises in mindful salutation or prostration, walking meditation exercise, and sitting meditation exercise. So there's actually a formalized process to initiate and develop mindfulness in the body. The mindfulness process or development is initiated also by using what is called the mental noting technique, or the mindful label. And that's a little bit strange if you're used to just giving a general comprehensive observation of the breath, for example, to start noting it. You might feel like your brain is getting a little tired when you do that. But actually what we're doing is utilizing the beta wavelength, which is the chattering mind. We're taking that wavelength and we're just putting a label there. And so instead of wandering, chattering mind, you're going thinking, 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 or wandering, 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 or chattering, chattering, chattering. And so it eventually reduces the amount of mental activity, and eventually it transforms that mental activity. And so there's efficacy in this methodology, even though it seems a little bit strange to begin with. And so, for example, new students were taught to do a kind of mindful bowing exercise, and then continued with mindful walking meditation, where you're bringing your attention to track the movement of the foot and note it, like right goes thus, left goes thus, right goes thus, in time with the movement. Or you're mentally tracking the action of the belly as it moves naturally without controlling the breath, as rising and falling and rising and falling. And so this is mindfulness of the body. You could do rising and falling while you're sitting or while you're lying down also. If you were standing, you would note standing, 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 or if walking normally, right, left, or walking, walking, walking. Or if walking slowly, right goes thus, left goes thus. Mindfulness of the feelings would be the contemplation of the three main kinds of feelings: happy, suffering, and neutral. Happy, we have all of the range of pleasant, comfortable, and emotional happy feelings. Suffering is the whole range of the painful, unpleasant, or suffering physical feelings. And neutral is everything in between. And again, the instructions would be to note these feelings when they occur, whether it's emotional or sensual. So you would note it as pain, 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 or suffering, 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 or maybe pleasant, 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 or happy, 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 or neutral, 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 indifferent, 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 or boring, boring, boring if it turns out that it's a little dull. Mindfulness of the mind was defined as being mindfulness or contemplation of all the different mind states or mental spheres, consciousness states which arise. And that's a little bit hard for new students who don't really know what the mind is. So for the beginning student, the instructions were to note just the thinking. So whenever you start thinking or the mind wanders, the initial instructions were note thinking, thinking, thinking. And if you could, to note it until the mind stops wandering, or until you can come back to the main object, which is the body, usually the movement of the rising and falling, or the right goes thus, left goes thus movement of the foot. And so when we become more adept at contemplating the mind, you begin to see different mind states arising. For example, mind with desire, mind without desire, mind with anger, mind without anger, mind with delusion, mind without delusion, a distracted mind, contracted mind, etc. And so there are various different mind states which also can arise, that in the contemplation of the mind we were trained to note them and to contemplate them. There are another group of mindfulness objects which are called the mindfulness of mind objects. And the word mind objects is a translation of the Pali word Dhamma, or dharmas in Sanskrit. And dharma or Dhamma with a small d, we have two kinds of Dhamma. We have dharma with the large D, like the Dharma or the Buddha Dharma, the teachings or the truth teachings of the Buddha, for example. And then we have Dharma with a small d, which is like conditioned states or phenomena. And the Dharma with the small d is what we're referring to here. In translation, the best translation I've heard was from Bhikkhu Bodhi, who said that contemplation of mind objects or